Bé, bona tarda. Hem deixat aquests 10 minuts sobretot perquè això, sabíem que hi havia gent que venia una mica més de lluny. Gràcies a tots per ser aquí. És un plaer pels estudis de Psicologia i Ciències de l'Educació i des del grup, sobretot el grup de recerca ET Online, poder organitzar aquest seminari sobre feedback i sobre la implementació del feedback i pràctiques del feedback en entorns diferents, presencials i virtuals. I sobretot això, poder compartir amb vosaltres aquestes reflexions, aquests exemples, i el que volem sobretot és això, que puguem discutir amb el professor que tenim avui aquí les diferents experiències i que sigui realment un diàleg. Com sabeu, hem convidat el professor David Carless, és un plaer tenir-lo avui, és un honor realment, crec que és una oportunitat que a més estiguem en aquest petit comitè per poder parlar i dialogar amb ells. I el que sí que volíem situar molt ràpidament, abans de la presentació, perquè aquí l'important és poder-lo escoltar amb ell, però sí que donar-vos una mica la situació de dir per què el convidàvem. Perquè nosaltres entenem, i ja portem força de temps donant a terme recerca en aquesta línia, és que entenem el feedback com un procés dialògic, un procés en el que no és només important el procés de donar feedback, sinó que entenem que el feedback és aquest feedback loop, aquest cercle, amb la idea que és tan important donar feedback com centrar-nos en com l'estudiant utilitza aquest feedback, què fa l'estudiant amb el feedback i, finalment, com l'implementa, com introdueix canvis en el text. Sovint, de fet, aquest matí amb el professor David Carless discutíem això, de dir que els professors donen molt de feedback, dediquem molt de temps a donar feedback, però sovint no sabem què fan els estudiants amb aquest feedback i sovint no fan res. Llavors hem dedicat molt de temps a donar, molt de temps, molts esforços, hem reflexionat molt sobre com ha de ser, però no tenim evidències ni de què és el que fan, però sobretot tampoc no els incentivem a que siguin actius en aquest procés. Llavors, des d'aquesta perspectiva, des d'aquesta idea del feedback dialògic, entenem que el que volem és posar l'estudiant en el centre del procés, és a dir, que sigui actiu amb el feedback que rep i que realment l'utilitzi. Aquesta és la idea, és a dir, de fet, amb ell discutíem aquesta proposta de no és tant el fet de donar i que nosaltres estiguem allà molt actius, sinó incentivar que l'estudiant utilitzi i que sigui ell més actiu i, per tant, passar-li una mica la pilota a l'estudiant. Per tant, volíem posar èmfasi en aquesta línia en què ens situem des d'aquesta perspectiva i això acaba tenint una sèrie d'implicacions a la pràctica. De fet, el que hem vist en les diferents recerques és que cal promoure aquest feedback dialògic, que vol dir això, que l'estudiant entoma el feedback i l'animem a que autoavaluï el seu propi procés, que contribueixi, que aquesta autoavaluació pròpia l'ajudi a regular-se, que hi hagi un diàleg entre professor i estudiant, entre els estudiants i entre l'estudiant en si mateix, és a dir, aquest diàleg intern també. Però com hauria de ser aquest feedback també? Nosaltres el que hem vist amb els diferents estudis és que hauríem de promoure un feedback que sigui epistèmic i suggerent, és a dir, que promogui sobretot la pregunta, és a dir, que plantegem preguntes a l'estudiant sobre el que ha fet, sobre els canvis que ha introduït i que li donem suggerències de com millorar. És a dir, en lloc de dir-li hauries de fer això, sinó preguntar més, doncs, creus que realment aquesta idea queda ben expressada o realment creus que vols dir això en aquest paràgraf? I proposar-li com podria procedir o què hauria de revisar o aquesta idea de feed forward, què hauria de fer en els següents passos. I tornem a posar èmfasis en aquesta idea de procés, que no és només donar feedback, sinó donar, que l'estudiant el processi i que l'implementi. Això només per situar. I, per últim, sí que volíem situar-vos en que estem ara en un projecte que és de 3 anys i que estem just en el mig, un projecte I+D, que duem a terme en el marc del grup de recerca ET Online, en el que participen l'Anna Espasa, la Rosa Mayordomo i la Montserrat Martínez, i en el que estem sobretot treballant en aquest projecte amb la idea de relacionar diferents canals del feedback, és a dir, com podríem promoure feedback a través d'àudio, a través de vídeo o escrit, i com això pot estar o no relacionat amb la càrrega docent. Sovint el que ens queixem és que donar un feedback més personalitzat, un feedback més individualitzat, provoca més càrrega per part del docent i el que volem veure és que en funció del canal que utilitzem potser el que podem fer és reduir aquesta càrrega. De fet, tenim una hipòtesi que un feedback donat amb àudio podria contribuir a que sigui un feedback més efectiu, és a dir, que ajudi en l'aprenentatge, perquè és molt més personalitzat, molt més individualitzat, però a la vegada no seria tanta càrrega pel professor. Per tant, estem en aquest moment analitzant tots aquests elements i, de fet, ara estem fent un seguiment molt exhaustiu de diferents pràctiques, senzillament també perquè tinguéssiu informació i perquè anem traient alguns resultats en aquesta línia. Res més. Arrel d'això jo dic que era per donar el marc de des de quina perspectiva ens situem i és en aquesta línia això, que ja hem anat seguint els treballs que ha dut a terme el professor David Carless i per això l'hem demanat a través del programa d'Internalization at Home, l'hem convidat a que vingui a Barcelona, poder discutir amb ell i sobretot tenir l'oportunitat d'entre tots d'avui poder discutir amb ell. Com heu pogut llegir la informació, i de fet us animo que busqueu a internet tota la informació, tota la seva experiència, però ell és professor de la Universitat de Hong Kong i està com a vicedegà a la Facultat d'Educació i és responsable d'aquests processos acadèmics en el marc de la Facultat d'Educació i, per tant, una persona que coneix molt bé com introduir aquests elements en la pròpia pràctica. I res més. A partir d'aquí el que us animo és això, escoltar bé aquesta presentació i que després puguem tenir una discussió ben rica pensant en les nostres activitats lectives i com podem introduir aquests canvis. Gràcies, and the floor is yours, David.
But it's great to be here, and thank you to Teresa and colleagues for inviting me. So I think, as much as I could understand, I think Teresa and I are on the same wavelength, the same page. I think the ideas are quite common. So at the beginning, I just want to mention two kind of themes that will come in my talk. One is the theme that for feedback to be real and for feedback to be useful, there must be student uptake, student action. That unless there is student action, we haven't truly provided feedback. We've provided information. If we give information and there's no action, then it doesn't really become feedback. And that is why it is so complex, because we often do not know whether our feedback is effective, whether the information we provide can actually influence the students and they can use it. So that's the first point, that feedback is only real if the students do something with it. The second point, and I think Teresa also mentioned this, is that what I'm going to suggest and the points I'm going to make in the talk, I hope should be feedback neutral, workload neutral. In other words, I hope that there is nothing I suggest that will create more work for you or for us. Because I think this is fundamental to feedback. And it follows from the first point that we need the students to do more and probably the teachers to do a little bit less. That because only the students can use feedback, the student role in feedback is the most critical role. And the teacher role is to some extent to provide guidance and information, but the teacher role is also to facilitate, to provide some support and encouragement and motivation for the students to act on the feedback. So those are kind of two overarching themes, the student uptake of feedback and that it should be workload neutral. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to put feedback into a slightly wider picture. By that I mean feedback is a core part of assessment. The kinds of assessment tasks the students are doing are going to increase or decrease the possibilities for student action on feedback. I'm going to suggest that feedback is part of pedagogy, that feedback is part of teaching and learning. I'm also going to suggest that feedback has a strong relational position or perspective, that the relationships between participants, such as teachers and students, and students will impact on the feedback. I'm going to tease out some principles of dialogic feedback that will include peer feedback and also online dialogues. And then towards the end, I'm going to try to discuss and tease out some of the issues and implications. So that's the kind of plan. So the first stage, trying to put feedback into a sort of bigger picture. Well, as I said, that feedback is facilitated or inhibited by the kind of assessment tasks we have. So, for example, if it's an examination, if it's one big examination at the end of a course, well, then obviously the prospects for feedback are somewhat reduced. There may still be possibilities, but usually examinations are one of the least productive assessment tasks for feedback. On the other hand, if we have a sequence of 3 or 4 tasks and students do task 1, then they get some feedback or comments, and then there is task 2 or task 3. There is more possibility for them to transfer the feedback. So I'm trying to suggest that feedback is a design issue, and that how we design assessment and how we design pedagogy is going to also impact on the prospects of students using the feedback. And then how we conceptualize learning and how we conceptualize teaching. If we see teaching and learning as mainly content-driven and memorizing facts, then that reduces the potential for feedback to be taken up. So a conceptualization of pedagogy is more about changing views, and deepening conceptualizations is going to have more prospects for dialogue. So even the way the classroom is organized. So if it's a classroom with the teacher giving a lecture from the front, with very little interaction, that's kind of closing down feedback opportunities. But even if it's a lecture, if the students are maybe having some peer collaboration, maybe the teacher gives some input for 20 minutes, then stops and gets the students to discuss in pairs, ask questions, maybe they have some tasks. So this kind of pedagogy is already setting the tone or allowing some possibilities for dialogue and for feedback and discussion. And then the third point, that feedback thrives when there are positive relationships, when the students feel comfortable with the teacher. If the teacher seems very open-minded, and the teacher is willing to engage in discussion, then we're setting a kind of tone. But you know, sometimes the teacher will say, "Any questions? No? Okay," and then run for the door. You know, so even the way the teacher looks at the audience will tell the students whether the teacher is more or less receptive to negotiation and discussion and question. So that's trying to sort of put feedback into a kind of wider plane. And I think that's important and maybe not obvious to all teachers. I think sometimes some teachers will have the idea, oh, feedback is something we do at the end of the course. We get the assignments, we are marking. I don't see feedback as synonymous with marking. In fact, sometimes marking and grading is not so conducive to feedback because it happens at the end. You know. This is the framework that I've been using in my work, and I think it tries to really conceptualize the different parts of the assessment and feedback process. So I'm starting with the assessment task, and as I've indicated, certain assessment tasks are more promising for feedback. And then on the left-hand side of the diagram, you've got the idea of what does quality look like? And I think this is a very important part of teaching and pedagogy, that we need to illustrate to students what quality academic work looks like. So if we take the most common assessment task, probably is an essay. So what is the difference between a good quality essay and an average quality essay and a poorer quality essay? And I think the only way the students can appreciate that is by analysing some sample essays. And through analysing samples, maybe on their own individually and with peers, and then with the teacher, scaffolding and guiding on the nature of a good essay or a good presentation or a good examination answer. So that's why I have those two links between the quality and the feedback, because the better the student's sense of quality, the more likely they are to engage with feedback messages. One of the reasons the students don't act on some feedback is because they can't really understand. Maybe the teacher will say, elaborate, but they don't know what they should elaborate. Or they have said everything they could think of saying. Or they don't know the difference between opinion and evidence. All of the students can say, I think this. But usually in academic work, we don't just want to know what somebody thinks. We want to know what is the evidence or the detail or the elaboration. So if the feedback is too subjective, unless the student knows or understands how to develop arguments, how to use evidence to support arguments, or how to embed literature in their arguments. Sometimes the students can summarize. Well, X professor says this, Y professor says that, but they're not always very good at using that literature to develop an argument or to synthesize. And if we can show them exemplars or examples of good writers using these rhetorical strategies, then they have a better chance of moving forward. So it's the idea of linking an understanding of quality with the engagement with feedback. What I want to just mention is the latest research I've done, which was to look at the practices of teachers who had won awards for teaching excellence. So in other words, they'd entered a competition in the university, either internal to the university or external across the country. And the teachers in this study had all won teaching awards. Now, I didn't assume that because they'd won a teaching award, they were necessarily the best teachers, but I thought maybe there is something interesting or attractive to students in their classrooms. Now, I work in a faculty of education, but I think there's much we can learn through looking at assessment and feedback across different disciplines. So I sampled these 5 disciplines: law, history, geology, business, and architecture. And you can imagine this was a lot of data, a lot of stories, a lot of narratives I could tell. Wasn't very easy to make it into a journal article, so I made it into a book. And this is the book. It's called Excellence in University Assessment, and it has some kind of theory chapters, some literature review chapters, and then it has the stories of those 5 teachers, and about, well, 2 chapters. 2 chapters are particularly focused on feedback. And then I also was part of a previous project. I was one of 4 editors, and this book was called Reconceptualizing Feedback in Higher Education, Developing Dialogue with Students. So it was following this theme that Teresa has introduced of sort of dialogue with students. So, you know, at the beginning they always say you should clarify your terminology. So I'm going to try and conceptualize feedback. As I've kind of implied, feedback can be comments, and it can be information, and that sort of commentary aspect. But the commentary aspect is rather teacher-centered or teacher-controlled. So what does the student do? So really we're trying to suggest that for feedback comments or for feedback information, there needs to be some kind of student action which starts some form of dialogue. Now, I don't mean this dialogue should be one teacher and one student. That's not practical and it's not feasible. So we've got to find other ways in which we can generate dialogue. And I think the most promising one is from peer to peer, which I will try to elaborate. So this is how, in the book, I defined feedback, and you can read it there. So you've got the idea of dialogue, you've got the idea of sense making, that to be meaningful, the students need to make sense of the information, which is often not easy to do, but they've got to make sense of it. I've said from varied sources. In other words, it's not just the teacher, it's the peers, but also the self. I think this is very fundamental. It sounds a bit paradoxical. Are we crazy if we talk to ourselves? But when we are working, we are having a dialogue with ourselves. We're thinking, is this working? Do I need to change the sequence? Do I need to elaborate here? Do I need to cut here? What more reading do I need to do? So when we're working, there is an inner dialogue, the dialogue between the writer and himself or herself. And you know, we all do that as we're working. We are thinking, do I need to write more? Do I need to write less? Which parts need? So it's this idea of inner dialogue to enhance the quality of the work or the learning strategies. And I think the idea of the learning strategies is also very important. That as teachers, we are trying to give the students feedback, not just on the work, but also on how they did the work. I think that's even more important. When I talk to my students, I ask them, I have some tutorial students who just come and talk to me once a year for about half an hour. And I ask them about their learning strategies. How do they prepare for the assignment? I find the ones who have good learning strategies, they're always the ones who get high grades. The ones who have poor learning strategies usually get the mediocre strategies. I'll give you an example. I had one student and I said, well, how do you try to prepare for your assignments? She said, I try to memorize. I try to memorize everything everything the teacher has told me. Okay, memorizing is part of learning, but memorizing is not a very sophisticated strategy. And at the end of the year, when I check her grades, she was mainly getting C grades. I had another student and I said, when you're preparing your assignments, what do you do? She said, what I do is I copy the rubric. I copy the rubric into my assignment. So at the top of the page, when I'm working on my assignment, the rubric is there, the criteria are there. And as I'm working, I check back to see if I've met the criteria. And as soon as she told me, I thought, she's going to get good marks. You know, taking ownership of the criteria, and the criteria, the rubric, is always in front of her. It's only when she submits the assignment, the final stage, she deletes the rubric. But it's there in front of her. For an excellent grade, I need to do this, this, this. So she's using the criteria in a very intelligent way. The weaker students, they say to me, oh, I look at the criteria, it's very academic, I can't understand it, I just have a look at it, and then I forget it. So I think if we can give the students feedback on their learning strategies, their learning skills, that's much more powerful than giving them feedback on the content. Because the skills and strategies you need for every piece of work. The content you often only need for 1 or 2 pieces of work. So I think there are certain kinds of feedback that are much more powerful than other kinds. Now, this is a very difficult one, I think. It's only feedback if the students take some action. Otherwise, it's just information. But it means we don't necessarily know immediately whether our feedback is successful or not. So we may give very constructive, helpful comments to the student, but if for some reason the student doesn't act on them, then we have not closed the feedback loop. So again, I think it's the idea that the students need to do more with the feedback. Maybe sometimes we need to do less. I think sometimes we overload the students. If you give them 3 or 4 pieces of advice, maybe they go away feeling, oh, I'm terrible, everything is bad, or 4 things can be difficult to remember. So maybe sometimes we give them 1 thing to work on. It's kind of focus, isn't it? So some principles of feedback or dialogue, that feedback is a process, not a product. Feedback should be promoting or encouraging learner action. That it's not just the teacher giving feedback, it's the peers, and it's also the self through this inner dialogue, or what is sometimes called internal feedback. And that internal feedback is critical because the main purpose of feedback should be to enhance the student ability to self-monitor or self-regulate their work. All students are self-regulating to some extent, but many of them are not doing it efficiently. So I see a key role of feedback as to help the students to self-regulate more effectively, to develop a stronger sense of what quality work looks like. And if they can understand what quality work looks like, then they are gradually in a better position to self-monitor. But it takes time. It's an ongoing, long-term process. But that's why I think the emphasis on the self and the inner dialogue and the engagement with quality is so central. So basically what I'm suggesting is that there are perhaps 3 main forms of dialogic feedback. The first one is what the teacher does. The second one is in the online environment. There could be some combination of teacher and peer, but putting emphasis on the peer, and the peer feedback and the internal feedback as being very essential parts of the process. So what can the teacher do? I think some of the most essential things the teacher can do is to demystify assessment. I think for the students, assessment is often very mysterious. What are they looking for? What do these criteria mean? What do I need to do to get a good grade? And I think students are very interested in this. They want to know the secrets of success. And particularly when they enter the university, they've come from secondary school. Secondary school is so different. They're used to very close contact with the teachers. They see them every day. And in university, we want a much higher level of performance. So I think helping them understand what university education is about, what is good performance in the university, to help them understand these rules of the game. And it's the same for us as academics. You know, when you're trying to obtain a research grant, or when you're trying to publish in a good journal, we need to understand what the journal is looking for, what the grant provider is looking for. So before we can win the game, we need to know what the rules of the game are. One of the ways in which we can help the students understand the assessment rules is through helping them to make judgments. Assessment is a process of judgments. So one of the ways we can train the students to make sound judgments is through engagement with rubrics. But rubrics, they're very dense, there are a lot of words, they're very academic. So a lot of students find it difficult to understand. So sometimes I take the rubric and I maybe take the grade B. You know, grade B is a good target. Maybe grade A is quite challenging. I take the example of a grade B in the rubric and I give the students a little 5-minute task. Summarize the criteria for grade B in your own words. So they spend a bit of time trying to make sense. And I think that's very helpful to them, to engage with and make sense of what the rubric means. But then even more importantly, I think, are samples. Samples of student work, maybe samples from previous year's assignments. And maybe the students can analyze 2 samples, and then maybe the first task is which sample is better and why. Then how can they be improved? And then what are the strengths and weaknesses of the samples? So this is trying to enable the students to appreciate the quality, to identify the quality in the piece of work. Because if students don't know what quality looks like, it's very difficult for them to produce it themselves. And I guess many of you in this room, you have a doctoral degree, you studied a PhD. When I started, the first thing I did is I wanted to look at a sample of a PhD thesis. When you do a research proposal, you want to look at a sample. So I think we all learn through looking at samples. Even when you're at school, did you maybe have to write a poem? And then maybe they give you a sample of a poem and you look at the rhyming scheme. So I think we learn through samples. So I think analysing samples, analysing exemplars, are one of the powerful things a teacher can do in helping to guide the students. So I'm trying to reconceptualize feedback a little bit as being guidance. I think I like the term guidance even more than feedback, because guidance can come during the process. There's a danger with feedback that too much comes at the end. They finish the exam, they finish the essay, they get the grade and some feedback, some comments. But it's often too late for them to act on it. So I have a feeling we should do more during and then maybe a little bit less at the end. We try to guide. This doesn't have to be labor intensive because we're analysing the exemplar with the whole class. So whether the class is 30 or 150 or 300, they can analyse the sample, they can discuss in pairs, and we can have some dialogue, and then the teacher can try to explain and scaffold the qualities of the exemplar. So as I've said, I'm trying to see guidance and feedback as being an integrated cycle within the learning process. So it's trying to position feedback and guidance during the process where the students can act on it. Because if you remember, my first principle was, in order for feedback to be useful, the students need to act on it. And if too much comes at the end, it's very difficult for them to act on. So it's this integration of guidance and feedback. And I think that applies whether it's an online environment or a face-to-face. In this diagram, I've just tried to indicate some possible steps in a kind of guidance and feedback loop. So we start with our task and we explain the task. We try to get the students to understand the criteria or rubric. Then we want them to maybe practice, to apply the criteria, maybe to review the work in progress through peer feedback. Building up to this fundamental principle that students need to self-monitor their work at an increasingly sophisticated level. So the students are doing more with their work and taking some of the burden away from the teacher of always having to fix all the student problems. Another way in which we can guide them is through this kind of interlinked task design. If we have a task 1 and then a task 2, and then the students can use the feedback from task 1 to task 2. So again, that's a design issue. And it implies that maybe we need to think more carefully about the sequence of tasks, and maybe we need to revisit some of the skills or the concepts so that these students have ample opportunity to be active feedback seekers and users. Okay, in the next stage I'm going to say a few things about technology-enhanced feedback. Now, these learning management systems such as Moodle or Blackboard or these virtual learning environments, they can be very useful for storing the feedback so that the feedback can be there visible. And maybe one strategy is to ask the students to state which previous feedback they've used for their next assignment. So getting them to actually reflect on the feedback they've used so that there is this attempt to close the feedback loop. Do you use Moodle in some of your universities or different Blackboard or wikis? Okay, well, they're also a very good platform for acting on collaborative use of feedback on ongoing learning processes. One of the teachers in my study, he set up a Facebook page for his students, and some of the students, they like to upload their work in progress to the Facebook, and then they had some peer feedback. Not all of the students wanted to do that. Some of them wanted to keep their work private. Some of them felt too embarrassed, or some of them they ran out of time. But there was a core group of about 15 or 20 students who found this very beneficial to upload and get some peer feedback. And I think this is very important, that we create the possibilities for peer feedback and we try to encourage the students. Again, as academics, I think when we're working on something, it's very common that we will ask one of our friends or academic contacts to give us feedback. So I think it's part of the academic community is peer feedback and peer review. One of the other teachers in my study used a blog, and you know what students are like. If there's no marks, they often don't engage. So he had like 15% of the marks on his course were for blog participation, and the students said to me, well, yes, if there's a blog but there's no marks, we wouldn't do it, but if there's some mark allocation, we will do it. Yeah, so that was in business, the idea that participation encourages the students. And then there was another course in my study where there was a blog, but there was no mark allocation. But the special thing about this blog is it had the current students, the past students, and some practitioners from industry who also participated. And the teacher said to me, if the feedback addresses the students' needs and interest, then they will treasure the feedback. And I think that's a powerful message. Does our feedback address the student needs and interest? Or is the feedback based on our agenda rather than the student agenda? So should we sometimes ask the students, what kind of feedback would you most like to receive? And sometimes I did that. When the students submit their assignment, I require them to write one sentence at the beginning. For this assignment, I would most like to receive feedback on the following. And I think that's useful because it starts a dialogue and then it forces them to think. Before they submit the assignment, they have to think, well, what am I generally good at doing? What am I not so good at doing? What am I trying to improve? And it was quite interesting to me. Some of the students will say something quite low level. I would like feedback on grammar, or I would like feedback on spelling. But other students would say, I would like feedback on how I develop the arguments. And you can probably guess, the student who said, I want feedback on how to develop an argument, is often a more sophisticated student than the one who said, I would like feedback on spelling and grammar. Because actually, spelling and grammar, they should be able to fix for themselves through proofreading and checking. This one is, I think, quite a trend, and I know in Open University of Catalonia they're interested in audio feedback. It's becoming very popular in Australia, that maybe instead of the written comment, we can record and send it via MP3 or some other technology instead of the written feedback. I think it must be instead of, otherwise it's too much work and it's a duplication. So some of the advantages in the literature of audio feedback, that it generally seems to be viewed positively by students. The students like it because it seems quite personal and it seems to show a certain amount of care and concern, and maybe you can give a bit more detail in your audio feedback, and maybe it seems like a conversation or a dialogue. It seems like you're talking to the student. But so far it's not clear that the evidence of impact on student learning is too powerful. What do the students do with the audio feedback? Is there still a danger they will listen to it and think, oh yes, that's interesting, but then they go to the restaurant or they go to sleep and then they don't actually act on it? So do we need a further step that they should respond to the audio feedback, either through their own audio or through some written acknowledgement or written action plan, again, so that we can close that feedback loop? And then what about if it's a failure? Do you say, oh, hello, how are you this evening? Oh, you failed. So how do you deliver audio feedback in a failure case? This could be problematic, I think. And then the workload. Is audio feedback time-saving, or is it going to be more time? Some people say that in the beginning it takes more time, but once you get accustomed to it. Some people say they can talk much more quickly than they can write. Some people find writing more time-consuming and difficult, and they can speak more fluently. I'm not sure. To me, I have a feeling it might be more workload. But some people tell me they think it's less workload. If it's more workload, I feel a bit discouraged. If you remember, my second key issue at the beginning was I wanted dialogic feedback to be less workload. So I think I'm only enthusiastic if audio feedback is less. Somebody told me they like to keep the audio to 3 minutes maximum. That seems to me quite a good idea. If it's 10 minutes, I think that's too much for the student. I think 3 minutes might be a nice guideline. So you just talk 3 minutes, give some key points. Attractive audio feedback, any interest? I know Teresa and colleagues are interested. Any questions or comments on audio feedback? Or
Audio feedback perhaps is more difficult for students to reuse it one time and another time. You know, if they have to go back to the feedback,
yes.
review it, I think it's more difficult if it's an audio feedback than a written one.
Yes, but I think, unfortunately, even for the written feedback, I don't think they go back to it very often. In principle, they could, but I think it's only the excellent student who does that. I think this is a big problem with feedback, isn't it? You may give them good quality written feedback, but there's still the danger they will read it and even maybe throw it away or put it in a corner, and then 3 years later the dust is gathering. And yeah, it's this element of how to get the students to act.
What did you
include answering to feedback as part of the assessment?
Oh, I see what you mean, yes. So, yeah, that's more powerful. I mean, or again, if we have the task design, so if they have 2 tasks and they get the audio feedback on task 1, and then they can use that relatively soon for task 2. That's why I think feedback is to a large extent an assessment task design issue. Because if they have to remember the audio feedback until 3 months later, then as you say, it's very difficult. Okay, I think I'll just keep going and then we can have some discussion more at the end. So I'm trying to emphasize the student role in seeking the feedback or generating or using the peer feedback. And I think a lot of the theorists of dialogic feedback, we're enthusiastic about the idea of peer feedback because peer feedback is much more plentiful. And sometimes the peer feedback is easier to accept. You know, the teacher is sometimes an authority figure, can be discouraging, you've got that power relation. So the peer feedback is available and plentiful. But is there a danger that students don't perceive that their peers can give useful comment? Maybe they think, I want to hear what the teacher thinks because the teacher has the knowledge, the teacher has the experience. So I think we have to try to convince the students that peer feedback is valuable. And I think this is a very important research finding, that actually composing the peer feedback is generally even more useful than receiving the peer feedback. Imagine you've got to analyze somebody's work, and then you've got to make suggestions. This is actually quite a cognitive... Oh, sorry. This is quite... I thought it was a question. It is. I just couldn't understand it. You can't act on the feedback if you can't understand it. But the idea that composing the feedback is cognitively engaging because you've got to analyze, you've got to think, and then you've got to make some suggestions. So I think when we do peer feedback, there are 2 ways we can learn. One is through receiving comments, but another one is through examining and analyzing. And you know, when you look at somebody else's work, you see another way of doing it. And one of my students told me when she analyzed somebody else's work, it actually gave her confidence. She realized how bad her classmates were, but she was able to benchmark her work. And other students said to me the opposite. I realize now that I need to raise my standard. Once I looked at the work of my classmate, who gets a grade A, I can now understand why I get a grade C. So I think analyzing the work of the classmate is a powerful learning process if the students do it seriously. I think sometimes there's a danger that they don't take it so seriously. But if we can convince them of the value, and I think the value is in the research. And I think we can also model our own learning processes. Before I submit an article to a journal, or before I submit a research grant, I will always try to find some colleagues or contacts or friends who can read through my work and give me some comments. You know, sometimes we get very immersed in our own work and we sometimes miss the bigger picture. So I think for us as academics, the peer feedback and the peer review is a very essential part of our learning. And I think we need to bring the students into that kind of academic community. So one of the things I've been trying to do in my work is to think about feedback can be sustainable. If you always rely on the teacher to do it, then it's not sustainable. We want to get to the position where we can self-monitor and we can generate the peer feedback so that it will last us for a lifetime. And again, if you did doctoral study, when you're doing your PhD, we often rely on our supervisor while we're a PhD student. But the good supervisor prepares you for after you finished your PhD. Because after you finish your PhD, no more supervisor. You've got to be sustainable, and then you've got to rely on your own resources for maybe the next 20 or 30 years. So if you finish your doctoral degree at the age of 35, you need to be able to sustain your own career without all the scaffolding and the support from your doctoral supervisor. Now, of course, it's much easier with the doctoral supervision process, but I think we have to try to create those kind of processes. So, of course, many challenges. I mean, what does feedback mean and what are its purposes? I think there's a lot of confusion around it and a lot of difficulty. And probably I've added to the confusion by some of the things I've said, but I think that's an issue. Do we teach the students about what feedback is? What are its limitations? How they can use it? Or do we somehow assume that students know how to use feedback? And I think we know they don't really. They actually receive a lot of feedback, but they're probably not making very good use of it. So maybe we need to have a conversation with students about feedback. What is feedback? How you can use it? What are the difficulties we have as teachers? Because feedback that is effective for one person may not be effective for another. Some people want a lot of praise and encouragement. Some people would like more critique. I want to know how I can get better. So it's very individual and very complex. We don't want to be like this, do we? We don't want to be buried under an avalanche of paper. So that's why I'm trying to suggest that we've got to push some of the work onto the students. We've got to train the students to engage with and use feedback. We've probably got to change our role a little bit. So our role is not so much somebody who gives feedback, but somebody who teaches the students how to use feedback, which is an equally difficult task. But if we can teach them how to generate and use feedback, we're preparing them for the longer term. If we're just correcting, that only fixes for a short amount of time. You correct something and then next week they come back and say, can you correct this? So we're trying to sustain them for the longer term. So these are some of the shifts in priorities I'm envisaging. If you remember at the beginning, I said I don't want you to do more. I want you to be kind of workload neutral. So here I'm suggesting that maybe we can have more dialogue within the class time and less at the end. And then I'm thinking if it's a task 1, task 2, task 3, the students want most feedback on the first task and less feedback on the final task. But is it the case that we treat everything equally? That we give as much comments on the final task as the first task? Well, why? What about first year versus final year? The final year students, the last assignment they're ever doing. Why give them so much feedback? It's the end. Surely students need most feedback in the first year or the first semester. You know, they come from secondary school. They're so anxious, they're worried. Is this good enough? But again, I want these things to be workload neutral. I think for every increase, there should be a corresponding decrease so that we're trying to make the feedback more effective. So not more feedback, but more effective feedback. And I think sometimes we overwhelm the students with too much. 4 pieces of feedback are probably too much. 1 or 2 pieces may be more digestible. I think this is a very difficult issue. What do we do with the lower achievers? I think the higher achievers, they are motivated, they're energetic, they already know how to play the game. They already know how to get good grades. My student who has very good learning strategies, one of her learning strategies is to always try to have dialogue with the teachers. So at the end of class, she likes to go up to the teacher and ask some questions. So she's very active in looking for feedback and looking for cues. She wants to understand what she needs to do to get an A grade. But for the less motivated, very difficult. But I think there are two strategies that I've tried to outline. One is the peer feedback. I think the lower achievers can learn a lot from the higher achievers through the peer dialogue. And then the other one, I think, is the analysing exemplars. I think for the most useful thing that the lower achieving students can do is to analyse some excellent quality work. And again, I think it's similar for us. If you said to me, I want to publish in journals, and I find it difficult, or I submit my articles and I keep getting rejected, to me the best strategy is to look at some examples written by excellent professors, and you try to benchmark your articles against the excellent professors, and you try to compare and contrast. What do I do in my literature review? What does the excellent professor do in their literature review? And I think you'll notice in the excellent professor, they have a little bit more critique, a little bit more synthesis. They're not just summarizing, but they're synthesizing and gently critiquing. So I think the benchmarking of our work against the quality, the best, is one of the most effective strategies both for us and our students. Okay, just in the last 5 minutes before I open it up for questions, I think underpinning most of what I've said is this idea of assessment literacy and feedback literacy. So as teachers, we need to be aware of what is a good assessment task design. We need to be aware of how we can help students understand rubrics. We need to try to help the students understand the role of feedback and how they can use feedback. So I think it's first assessment and feedback literacy for teachers, and then it's trying to scaffold or train the students in the feedback literacy. And then the very final slide is kind of a summary of the points I've tried to cover this evening. It's the idea of integrating the assessment task design with the feedback through a cumulative sequence of tasks. It's emphasizing the idea of the guidance, the timely dialogues, with the online feedback, the technology-enhanced feedback strategies, and the peer feedback. And it's this idea of student self-monitoring and self-regulation so that the feedback becomes sustainable and not so reliant on the teacher. But it's getting towards dinner time, I guess. So I'd like to open the floor for any questions or comments from you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.